What remains after a door is open that should have stayed closed? Across deserts, mountains, forests, and frozen plains, people have entered ancient chambers believing they were stepping into history. They carried lanterns, notebooks, cameras, sensors, and the quiet confidence of science. They expected dust, bone, stone, and the patient silence of the dead. Instead, again and again, they encountered something harder to name, a voice where no voice should be, a sickness with no clear source, instruments that failed at the threshold, memories that blurred, teams that returned changed or did not return at all. In the official record, these moments are often reduced to accidents, contamination, stress, coincidence, and sometimes that may be true. Archaeology is not magic. Tombs are physical places shaped by time, chemistry, and the fragile perceptions of the human mind. And yet, certain stories refuse to settle into ordinary explanation. They linger like dust in a shaft of light. They gather in the margins of reports, in missing pages, in the uneasy pause before an expert says, "We still don't know." This is not a story about curses in the old theatrical sense. It is a story about thresholds, about what happens when curiosity meets warning, when reason meets mystery, when the modern world places its hand on stone shaped by forgotten hands. The tomb, after all, is never just a container for the dead. It is also a message from the living who built it, a final act of care, fear, power, or remembrance. So we begin here, at the mouth of sealed chambers scattered across the world. Not to declare what is true beyond doubt, but to ask a quieter, deeper question. When ancient places resist us, are they hiding superstition or preserving a form of knowledge we have not yet learned how to hear? What was really released when the most famous tomb in the world was opened? The story begins in a narrow valley of heat, stone, and long expectation. In 1922, after years of searching, Howard Carter and his team cut through the packed earth of the Valley of the Kings and found a staircase descending into darkness. At the bottom stood a sealed doorway, still carrying the weight of more than 3,000 years. When the breach was finally made, the first glimpse was not of death, but of splendor. Gold caught the lamplight. Wood, linen, alabaster, and ritual objects waited in stillness, as if time itself had been persuaded to stop. For the modern world, it felt like a triumph of scholarship, patience, and luck. Yet almost immediately, another narrative began to gather around the discovery, quieter at first, then impossible to ignore. Lord Carnarvon, who had financed the expedition, died soon after the tomb's opening. Others connected to the site also fell ill, suffered strange declines, or died earlier than expected. Newspapers rushed to call it a curse, turning grief into legend. Science pushed back, pointing to infection, contaminated air, ancient molds, stress, coincidence. And still the pattern remained haunting enough that even skeptics lowered their voices when speaking about it. Perhaps that is what makes this chapter endure. Tutankhamun's tomb did not simply reveal a buried king. It exposed the fragile border between explanation and unease. Ancient Egyptians had taken extraordinary care to protect the dead, surrounding a young ruler with amulets, seals, prayers, and symbols meant to preserve order beyond the grave. Whether those protections were spiritual, psychological, or material, they were never designed for modern visitors with cameras and flashbulbs. We often imagine archaeology as a clean act of recovery, as if the past were waiting patiently to be understood. But some discoveries do not greet us like old friends. They remind us that memory can be guarded, that reverence and trespass may look dangerously similar, and that even in the age of evidence, one open door can still leave the world unsettled. Can a warning carved in stone outlive the language that first gave it meaning? Long before modern headlines turned tombs into legends, ancient builders were already thinking about intrusion. They placed words at entrances, on walls, beneath thresholds, and beside the dead. Not always as dramatic threats, but as declarations of order. These messages spoke to gods, to descendants, to rivals, and perhaps to strangers not yet imagined. They were less about spectacle than about boundary. They said, "This space has a purpose, and you are not outside its consequences." In some burial sites, the inscriptions are direct enough to sound almost contemporary. They speak of punishment, unrest, judgment, or divine witness. In others, The language is ceremonial and easy to misunderstand, full of metaphors that do not travel cleanly across centuries. A line intended as sacred protection can later be read as menace. A prayer for cosmic balance can become, in the modern imagination, a curse. Translation does not merely carry meaning, it also bends it. And yet, even when scholars caution against sensational readings, the emotional force of these warnings remains. Standing before an ancient tomb, reading words shaped by someone who feared disturbance thousands of years ago, it becomes difficult to dismiss them entirely. The inscription may not promise supernatural revenge in the way popular culture prefers, but it does express something profound. The dead were not abandoned. They were defended by language, ritual, and memory. There is another layer to this. A warning does not need mystical power to change behavior. It can work through the mind, through expectation, through the quiet authority of a voice from another age. Once read, it enters the imagination. Every sound becomes sharper. Every accident feels loaded with meaning. The tomb has not cast a spell, exactly. It has altered the emotional weather of the room. Maybe that is why these inscriptions continue to matter. They remind us that language can survive as architecture of belief. Even after empires fall and scripts are forgotten, a human message can remain standing at the threshold, asking the same question across time. When we cross into the past, do we come as witnesses or as violators? What if the danger was never a curse at all, but something older, smaller, and almost invisible? Not every tomb protects itself with symbols. Some do it with air, with darkness sealed for centuries, with bacteria, mold, spores, and chemical residues that wait patiently in stone chambers until a living body breaks the balance. To the ancient world, such consequences may have felt spiritual. To modern science, they often look biological. But the line between those explanations is not always as clean as we like to imagine. When archaeologists enter confined burial spaces, they do more than disturb artifacts. They disturb an environment. Air that has not circulated in generations can carry toxins or fungal particles. Organic matter, wood, cloth, oils, food offerings, even human remains, changes slowly over time, creating conditions that may be harmless in one context and dangerous in another. A cough, a fever, a sudden weakness after an excavation may not point to the supernatural. It may point to a chamber that remained chemically and microbiologically alive long after its builders were gone. And yet knowledge does not always dissolve mystery. In some ways it deepens it. There is something profoundly unsettling about the idea that the dead can still affect the living through the patient logic of decay. No ghost is required, no curse needs to be spoken. Time itself becomes the mechanism. The tomb becomes a container not only of memory, but of processes too slow for the eye to see. This is one of the quiet lessons archaeology keeps teaching us. Ancient spaces are not frozen scenes, they are active systems. Dust settles, minerals shift, microorganisms survive, and human certainty enters far too quickly. What looks like triumph at the moment of discovery may also be an encounter with forces we underestimated simply because they did not fit the romance of exploration. Perhaps the oldest mistake is thinking that rational explanation makes a story less powerful. It does not. Sometimes the truth is more humbling than legend. We open a chamber hoping to study the past, only to discover that the past is not inert at all. It still has ways of touching us, entering us, and reminding us that wonder and vulnerability often arrive in the same breath. Why do some of the most unsettling discoveries begin not with a death, but with a feeling no instrument can measure? In excavation journals, there are moments that rarely make the final report. A worker refuses to enter a chamber after hearing what he describes as whispering. A photographer asks for a break because the air feels wrong, though the readings appear normal. A seasoned researcher, trained to distrust intuition, writes a single strange sentence in the margin of a notebook. We should not have gone in today. These fragments are easy to dismiss. Archaeology is exhausting work. Heat, fatigue, cultural expectation, grief, and isolation can shape perception in powerful ways. Teams often work in places layered with local stories, ancestral reverence, and long-standing warnings. The mind is not separate from its setting. It listens to silence and begins, almost involuntarily, to compose meaning. But that may be exactly why these moments matter. A tomb is never just physical space, it is emotional architecture. It narrows light, alters sound, slows breathing, and concentrates attention until every scrape of fabric and every flicker of shadow feels personal. What one person calls superstition, another might call heightened awareness. The experience is subjective, yes, but not trivial. Again and again, accounts from around the world describe an atmosphere that changes at the threshold. Not proof of haunting, not evidence of a curse, something subtler. A sense that the chamber is not empty, even when it clearly is. Perhaps this is the mind reacting to confinement and antiquity. Perhaps it is the body registering environmental cues before conscious thought can name them. Or perhaps ancient builders understood something about ritual space that modern language struggles to capture. We live in a culture that trusts measurements, and rightly so. Yet human experience has always exceeded what can be graphed. Fear, awe, reverence, unease, these are forms of knowledge too, imperfect, but real. When archaeologists hesitate at a doorway for reasons they cannot fully explain, the moment tells us less about ghosts than about the enduring power of place. Maybe the deeper mystery is not whether tombs are cursed. Maybe it is why certain spaces, shaped by human intention long ago, can still reach into the nervous system of a stranger and make the present moment feel suddenly, unmistakably ancient. What happens when the people closest to discovery begin to sound less certain than the stories told about them? Public memory often prefers clear endings. A tomb is opened, a misfortune follows, a curse is born. But the private reality of excavation is usually less dramatic and more human. It unfolds in long days of cataloging, cleaning, argument, boredom, fragile excitement, and the slow accumulation of details that resist neat interpretation. By the time a mystery reaches the public, it has already passed through many minds, each leaving its own shadow on the account. Some archaeologists dismiss the language of curses entirely, treating it as tabloid invention. Others were more cautious. They did not claim supernatural harm, but they admitted that certain sites left deep impressions, disturbing dreams, persistent anxieties, a feeling of pressure that lingered after the work ended. Not because they had abandoned reason, but because reason did not erase experience. It simply framed it differently. This tension matters. We often imagine science and mystery as enemies, as if one must conquer the other. Yet the people who work most closely with the ancient world know that the relationship is more complicated. Scientific discipline demands skepticism, but honest skepticism also leaves room for uncertainty. It allows a researcher to say, I know what the data suggests, and I also know what I felt standing in that chamber. Those are not always the same sentence. There is humility in that admission. Tombs remind us that evidence arrives incomplete. Records are lost. Bodies decay, environments alter, witnesses disagree. Even the most careful excavation is partly an act of reconstruction. We gather fragments and build understanding around absence. In that sense, archaeology is not only a science of objects, it is a study of human limits. Maybe that is why these stories endure so strongly around the people who excavate them. The archaeologist becomes a bridge between worlds, trained in method, yet vulnerable to wonder. Grounded in data, yet exposed to the psychological force of ancient places. And perhaps that is the real drama hidden beneath the myth of curses. Not a battle between truth and fantasy, but the quieter struggle of thoughtful people trying to remain honest in the presence of what they cannot fully explain. Can an object carry fear simply because too many people have touched it with expectation? Not all tomb stories begin at the moment of excavation. Some begin afterward, when a mask, a figurine, a sarcophagus lid, or a fragment of carved stone leaves its original resting place and enters the modern world. Once removed from darkness and placed behind glass, an artifact is supposed to become stable, classified, understood. Yet certain objects seem to gather stories instead of settling them. Museum workers have spoken, sometimes only in private, about pieces that made staff uneasy. A crate arrives damaged after a sequence of improbable delays. A conservator falls ill during restoration. A display suffers repeated technical failures for no obvious reason. Visitors linger too long in front of one case, then leave with a strange sense of sadness they struggle to explain. None of this proves anything beyond coincidence. But repeated coincidence has a way of becoming narrative, and narrative has power. Part of that power comes from displacement. A burial object is made for a relationship between the dead, the living, and the world of belief that binds them. Remove it from that network, and something changes. The artifact survives materially, but its meaning becomes unstable. It is no longer protected by ritual, language, or place. It enters markets, catalogs, storage rooms, exhibitions. It becomes visible to strangers who know its age, but not always its purpose. In that transition, we often reveal more about ourselves than about the object. We project dread, awe, guilt, fascination. We wonder whether beauty can be separated from disturbance, whether preservation can erase the violence of removal. The so-called curse may not reside in the artifact at all. It may live in the unresolved tension between admiration and appropriation. This is why some pieces feel heavier than their weight. They remind us that history is not neutral once it is taken into the present. An ancient object can become a mirror, reflecting the ethics of those who possess it. And perhaps the unease people feel is not a supernatural warning, but a human one. A quiet recognition that to hold the past in our hands is not the same as having earned the right to keep it. What if the most enduring curse is not death, but misunderstanding? The deeper archaeologists travel into the past, the more they confront a difficult truth. Every excavation is also an interpretation. The chamber is real, the bones are real, the objects, inscriptions, pigments, and tools are undeniably there. But the story that emerges around them is shaped by modern language, modern fears, and modern hunger for meaning. Somewhere between artifact and explanation, distortion begins. This is especially true with tombs. Burial sites are intimate by design. They are built from grief, belief, love, hierarchy, and hope. To open one is to enter a space that was never meant for us. That alone creates tension. Then come the headlines, the documentaries, the whispered retellings, each adding a layer of certainty to things that were once ambiguous. A protective inscription becomes a threat. A burial ritual becomes evidence of secret knowledge. A tragic illness becomes proof of punishment. And yet the truth is often more moving than the legend. Ancient people took extraordinary care in preparing the dead because they believed memory mattered. The tomb was not simply a place to hide a body. It was a structure of continuity, an attempt to protect identity from time. Food, jewelry, tools, amulets, painted scenes, carved names, these were not decorations in the modern sense. They were acts of preservation. They said this person lived, and that life should not disappear without witness. When we reduce such places to tales of curses alone, we risk missing the human tenderness beneath the fear. We begin to treat the dead as plot devices rather than people. We inherit the drama, but lose the dignity. That may be the real cost of sensational storytelling. It narrows the past into entertainment when the past was always larger, stranger, and more deeply human than that. So perhaps the question is not whether tombs punish those who enter, but whether we punish history when we refuse to see it whole. In our search for mystery, do we listen closely enough to the quieter truth that every grave, no matter how ancient, was once built by hands that loved someone enough to remember them against the darkness? Why do some tombs seem to keep rewriting their stories long after the excavation ends? In the years that follow a major discovery, the chamber itself often falls silent. The real noise begins elsewhere, in archives, interviews, letters, family recollections, and newspaper clippings that do not quite agree. A date shifts. A witness contradicts an earlier account. An illness once described as ordinary becomes suspicious in retrospect. The facts remain, but the atmosphere around them changes, as if the tomb has moved from earth into memory where certainty is far harder to preserve. This is where legend grows best. Not in the moment of opening, but in the gaps that come afterward. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We connect one death to another, one broken photograph to one missing page, one coincidence to a chain of invisible meaning. Sometimes those connections reveal something real. Just as often, they reveal our discomfort with randomness. We would rather live inside a story than inside chance. Yet chance is not the whole answer either. The people who excavate burial sites do not emerge untouched. Even when nothing goes visibly wrong, they carry away an altered relationship to time. They have stood in rooms built for eternity and handled objects last seen by mourners whose names are gone. That experience can change the tone of a life. It can make ordinary days feel strangely thin, as if the modern world were less solid than it seemed before. Perhaps that is why the record keeps shifting. The tomb does not spherically produce data, it unsettles the people around it. And unsettled people tell stories differently. They remember through grief, fear, pride, guilt, and awe. A story told once in technical language may later return as confession. A detail dismissed in youth may become meaningful in old age. The excavation ends, but interpretation keeps breathing. And so the so-called curse continues in another form, not as supernatural revenge, but as narrative afterlife. A tomb enters culture and refuses to become still. It asks to be retold, revised, argued over, humanized. Maybe that is the final irony. We dig into the earth searching for what was buried, only to discover that the most restless thing of all is not the dead but the living mind trying to make peace with what it has uncovered. What do local stories know that official history sometimes forgets to ask? Long before archaeologists arrive with permits and instruments, burial places often live inside community memory. A hill is avoided after sunset. A ruined chamber is spoken of with courtesy. Children are told not to cross a certain line of stones. These warnings may sound like folklore to outsiders, but folklore is rarely empty. It is often a storage system for caution, respect, and accumulated experience passed from one generation to the next. When excavations ignore those inherited boundaries, tension can rise quickly. Local guides may hesitate. Elders may object not because they reject knowledge, but because they understand the site differently. To them, the tomb is not merely a historical resource. It belongs to a moral landscape. It is part of ancestry, memory, and responsibility. Disturbing it may not unleash magic in the theatrical sense, but it may upset an order that has held meaning for centuries. Modern archaeology has grown more attentive to this truth, though not always soon enough. In earlier eras, the language of discovery often treated sites as prizes waiting to be claimed by science. Today, many researchers recognize that excavation without cultural humility can become another form of erasure. The past is not only buried in objects, it also survives in living relationships to place. Sometimes the people closest to a tomb understand its significance in ways no excavation report can fully capture. This does not mean every warning is literal. It means warnings deserve to be heard before they are translated into skepticism. A community's fear may contain environmental knowledge, historical trauma, sacred obligation, or subtle observations outsiders are too hurried to notice. The ancient world does not come to us only through stone and bone. It also comes through voice. Perhaps that is one of the most important lessons in all these stories. A tomb is never isolated from the people who live around it, remember it, protect it, or mourn what has already been taken from it. If there is a curse in ignoring that, it is not mystical punishment. It is the loss of understanding itself. We gain artifacts, perhaps, but risk losing the human context that made them meaningful in the first place. And without that context, even the most spectacular discovery can feel strangely incomplete. What does it mean to preserve the dead when preservation itself can become a form of disturbance? By the time a tomb reaches the modern world, it is already fragile. Stone shifts, pigments fade, wood dries and cracks, linen turns to dust at the lightest touch. The chamber may have survived centuries in darkness, only to begin changing the moment it is opened. Air enters, temperature fluctuates, moisture moves, cameras flash, footsteps alter the floor. The effort to save the past can, paradoxically, start unraveling it. This is one of archaeology's quietest dilemmas. To leave a site sealed may protect it, but it also keeps its knowledge hidden. To excavate and conserve it may reveal extraordinary truths, but at a cost. Every action introduces change. The brush that clears a painted wall also exposes it. The glass case that protects an artifact removes it from the world it was made to inhabit. Preservation is never neutral. It is always a negotiation with loss. And still, people continue the work because forgetting has its own violence. Without conservation, Names disappear, stories collapse, and entire civilizations risk becoming abstraction. The challenge is not whether to care for the past, but how to do so without mistaking possession for stewardship. That difference matters. One seeks control, the other accepts responsibility. This is where the old language of curses becomes strangely useful again, not as literal punishment, but as moral metaphor. It reminds us that the dead are not raw material. They are the remains of lives once held inside families, cultures, and systems of belief. A burial chamber is not simply a container of information. It is a threshold that asks something of the living before it yields anything in return. Perhaps that is the real test of modern knowledge. Not whether we can open the tomb, classify its contents, and explain its mysteries, but whether we can do so with enough restraint to remember that some forms of understanding require reverence. In the end, the question may not be how much we can recover from the past. It may be whether our methods reveal wisdom or only our impatience with what was never ours to fully claim. What if the final secret of these tombs is not about death at all, but about the living need to believe that some boundaries still matter? After all the case studies, all the reports, all the whispered stories repeated across decades, one truth remains unexpectedly clear. The idea of the cursed tomb endures because it speaks to something larger than archaeology. It touches a modern anxiety that progress has made everything accessible, everything measurable, everything available to be opened, cataloged, and explained. A sealed chamber resists that assumption. It stands in the path of our confidence and asks whether knowledge without restraint is wisdom at all. That question is why these stories continue to move us. Not because we truly expect mummies to rise or invisible forces to strike down intruders, but because we recognize a moral drama hidden beneath the myth. A tomb marks a line between curiosity and trespass, between study and violation, between remembrance and possession. It forces us to confront a possibility the modern world often avoids, that not every silence is an invitation. And yet, the answer cannot simply be to turn away from the past. Human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We excavate because we long to know who came before us, what they feared, what they honored, and how they imagined time. To study tombs is, in a sense, to study our oldest argument with mortality. We open chambers not only to recover artifacts, but to ask whether memory can survive the body, whether care can outlast a civilization, whether love can leave a trace in stone. Maybe that is the deeper reason curses never disappear. They dramatize a truth we already feel. The past is not passive. It places ethical demands on the present. It asks us to proceed slowly, to question our entitlement, to notice the difference between uncovering and taking. And when we fail, the punishment is not always illness or ruin. Sometimes it is subtler. We lose proportion. We lose humility. We lose the ability to tell the difference between discovery and conquest. In that sense, the most haunting tombs are not the ones that frighten us. They are the ones that ask whether we still know how to enter a place with reverence and leave with our humanity intact. What remains when all the explanations have been given and the unease still lingers? By now, the chambers are familiar. We have walked through sealed corridors, read warnings in stone, traced illness to spores, fear to atmosphere, legend to grief, and misunderstanding to the human need for a story. We have watched artifacts leave the earth and enter museums, listened to archaeologists speak in the careful language of evidence, and heard local memory insist that a place can be sacred long after outsiders decide it is simply historical. Much has been explained, and yet something remains. It is not, perhaps, a curse in the old sense, not a force waiting in darkness to punish the curious. What remains is harder to dramatize and, for that reason, more enduring. It is the realization that some places concentrate human meaning so intensely that entering them changes us. A tomb is one of those places. It gathers love, power, ritual, fear, craftsmanship, grief, and hope into a single enclosed space. When such a place is opened, the change is not only physical, it is moral, psychological, and symbolic. This is why the most thoughtful encounters with the past often leave people quieter than before. Not because they have seen evidence of the supernatural, But because they have felt the weight of continuity, the dead were not abstractions. They were individuals carried into burial by the hands of the living. They were protected by customs, words, offerings, and architecture because someone believed their passage mattered. That knowledge can humble even the most rational mind, and perhaps that is the thread connecting all these stories. The so-called curse is often a language we use when ordinary words fail. It names the discomfort of crossing a threshold we do not fully understand. It gives shape to guilt, awe, uncertainty, and reverence. It reminds us that some discoveries are not simply discoveries. They are encounters with the limits of our own perspective. So before the final chapter closes, one question remains suspended in the air like dust in late light. When the past unsettles us, is it warning us away from hidden danger, or asking us to become the kind of people who know how to listen before we touch? In the end, the story of cursed tombs is not really about punishment. It is about the fragile relationship between knowledge and humility. We began with sealed doors and stories of fear, with archaeologists stepping into chambers where air had slept for centuries and where every object seemed to carry the gravity of another age. We followed the path from superstition to science, from rumor to record, from biological explanation to psychological truth. And what we found was not a single answer, but a deeper kind of question. The past does not speak in one voice. It speaks through stone inscriptions and broken tools, through illness and coincidence, through local memory and scholarly restraint, through the beauty of burial goods and the silence of the dead themselves. Each tomb offers evidence, but also resistance. It reminds us that history is never simply extracted. It must be interpreted, and interpretation always reveals something about the interpreter. That may be why these stories continue to endure across generations. They offer more than mystery. They offer perspective. In a world that rewards speed, access, and certainty, the tomb stands for something slower and more demanding. It asks for patience. It asks for context. It asks us to remember that not everything hidden is waiting to be possessed. Some things were hidden to be protected, honored, or kept whole against the eroding force of time. And yet, there is hope in that realization. The existence of boundaries does not diminish human curiosity. It dignifies it. To wonder responsibly is one of the highest forms of respect. To seek truth without stripping away reverence is perhaps the closest we come to wisdom. The real inheritance of archaeology, then, is not the thrill of opening what was sealed. It is the chance to meet the lives of others with enough care that their memory is not consumed by our hunger to know. So the final question is not whether ancient curses are real. It is whether we can face the unknown with intelligence, tenderness, and restraint. Because every tomb, in its own quiet way, asks the living the same thing. When you come looking for the pen, what kind of future do you carry with you?